So we're very used to this colonized mind aspect. And so what do we do when we get our utility bill in the mail every month? I'm guessing that most urban people get a utility bill in the mail every month, even if it's tiny in this crowd. How many people don't get a utility bill at all? That's what I thought, almost nobody. So when we get a utility bill, a colonized mind, does it ever occur to us to think, by what authority did PG&E take our money and invest it in fill in the blank? Right? Nuclear power, another dam, you know, more money into the pockets of their board of directors, right? By what authority does that happen? When a cell phone company tries to put up towers, there's 8 in February in the Portland paper. I saw an article, 800 cell phone towers coming soon to Portland. 800. And so what do? It's once again, we're organized by single issue after single issue after single issue. I don't know how many people have heard my talks in the previous years, but I didn't want to be a broken record around all this corporate legal history. But I wanted to give you just a little taste of it again for folks who haven't heard it before. Because one of the reasons that we're so tied up as concerned citizens, my preference for a phrase instead of as activists, is that we've forgotten our history and our minds have become colonized around how we ended up in this situation. That actually, throughout the 1800s, corporate charters existed one at a time, created by the state legislature. Corporations were allowed to keep no secrets, no financial secrets, nothing in the vault that was secret from a state legislature. They were prohibited from making donations to candidates or influencing elections of any kind. It included lobbying. Their charters only existed for 10 to 30 years, and then they were automatically revoked unless the investors came back to the state legislature and asked for a renewal of their charter. They weren't allowed to own property or to speculate on it or to sell it or to subdivide it. They weren't allowed to own property unless they needed it to fulfill their charter. They weren't allowed to make donations to civic or charitable organizations, and on and on and on. And that was the norm for a century. And by the late 1800s, and it's an interesting but too long story to talk about tonight, much of this history was wiped off the political legal map. And corporations started winning one Supreme Court decision after a time to overrule what citizens had understood was their power and authority. And here are just a few examples of things we now take for granted as what Paulo Freire calls the unconscious oppressed, so that we barely even understand that we're oppressed, we're unconscious. So we assume that things have always, in fact, somebody I think said this a few minutes ago, assume that things have always been this way. We assume that corporations have as their primary goal to maximize profits. Turns out this goal was only became a requirement in 1919 when Henry Ford's car company was sued by his stockholders. He actually wanted to lower the prices of his cars so that his workers on his assembly line could afford to buy them, because they wanted them too. And his stockholders sued and said, no, shareholder return, maximizing shareholder return is your highest priority under law. And they went all the way to the Supreme Court and they won, 1919. So we take it for granted that corporations have to maximize profit. That's a Supreme Court decision. We take it for granted that corporations can speak to us to influence our political opinions or to sell us products through advertising. Turns out it wasn't until 1936 when they won the right of free speech. Corporations won the right to interfere in union organizing drives in 1947. Corporations won the right to bar a federal inspector from entering their factory to conduct a search in 1906. Corporations won the right to a jury trial in 1908. You notice these are all Bill of Rights and other amendment protections. This is the rights of persons constitutionally. Rights, rights, rights. Corporations won the right to not be charged higher taxes than human beings in 1933. Corporate lawyers won the legal argument that donations to candidates or political parties is the same as free speech in 1976. Money equals speech, said the Supreme Court. So to limit how much a corporation can donate would limit its right to speak, thus opening the door for huge donations by corporations. Corporations won the right not to speak. Their lawyers claim now that we've won First Amendment rights to speak, as if we were persons, doesn't that also give us the right to not speak? The right not to speak gave them for the first time the right to refuse to print certain labeling on their packaging, food labeling, county of origin labeling. And that right has been expanded. So these are all so-called rights for corporations. They're the centerpiece of where this elite rule comes from. Yes, they have power because they control a lot of capital, but their much greater power comes from their rights, which they've been winning for more than a century. There was a huge, huge uprising of people in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, early 90s, and early 20th century that has ended up being called the populist movement. And I'm really intrigued by what's happening in Portland, because the bit of reading that I've done about the populist era of the late 1800s makes me feel like there's something very significant brewing here. And you folks know that way better than I, because most of you live in this area. At the height of the populist uprising against this crazy stuff, at any one time, according to Lawrence Goodwin, who's the author of The Populist Moment, which is another book, on any one evening, the populists had 13,000 gatherings going across the country on any evening. At their height, and these weren't just political meetings, and one of the reasons that I'm really intrigued by what the VBC is and what just the culture of this community is that it's really mixing in a really profound way that I think is essential for the arts of democracy. It's really mixing people learning to be powerful and people learning all sorts of skills of all varieties and people playing with each other and eating with each other and laughing and singing and dancing with each other. It was a cultural revolutionary moment in the United States. One of the other things that made it really extraordinary, it was unique in the history of mass democratic social movements in this country. It's the only mass democratic social movement in our history that had rich and poor alike working together, that had factory workers and farmers working together, that had black people and women as leaders at a time that black people and women had no personhood yet under law. It was really, really something. And I think that's maybe one of the biggest missing pieces in what I would call maybe a sustainability uprising that's going on in Portland and beyond, is that having been here for the last 3 years, what I see is a mostly very young and mostly very hip, and as far as I can tell, mostly historically very privileged and maybe downwardly mobile, which is what I was in my 20s and 30s too, probably still am, group of white folk, by and large. And I have a hunch that if we could figure out in this movement and in the larger sustainability movement in Portland and Multnomah and beyond, how to bridge this gap with the vast majority of people who feel like they have no choice but to work 40 hours or more a week for wages, I think there might be some really interesting, very positive explosions going on in this sustainability movement that you folks are amazingly leading.